Okay, so let's start with the McLaren F1. Now, along with the Mercedes CLK GTR and a few others, it's one of the only cars in the game that you can't actually apply modifications to. However, with the use of cheat codes, you actually can. Now, the differences are that it's slightly lower to the ground and for some reason the rear spoiler is removed. Apart from that, even though there's no difference to the stats on the car selection screen, in the race you do definitely feel that it is quicker, brakes better, handles better, etc. So even though it doesn't appear to have had a stats increase, it definitely does. And with some colour schemes, you can actually see that there are two colours instead of just one. It's particularly apparent with here the blue colour scheme, now it's purple added on, and with the black as well. Now, aside from just the racing modifications, there are actually a few hidden colour schemes that were removed from the game, but still exist in the game's code, so you can access them with cheat codes. That blue was one of them, and now you have this kind of deep red as well, and more. Now, if the unmodified version and the modified versions look the same, then I've just shown the modified version. However, if they look different, like here, then I'll show both, just so you can see the difference. Now here are all the standard colour schemes of the CLK GTR. As I said earlier, you can actually apply racing modifications to it, but only with the use of cheat codes, which suggests that it was a feature that they wanted to include for this car, but possibly just took it out because the car, and the McLaren as well, are just too fast on their own to actually warrant modifications. But here, the differences are more significant. You can see that it now has a stripe, which is something that the McLaren doesn't really do. It does have the two colour schemes on certain versions of it, but however, they come across as quite glitchy, whereas here it's just a definitive stripe. So it's something that was, well, that it feels like it was just more developed. So it's a shame that it got taken out. And also I liked the McLaren. It has hidden colour schemes that still remain in the game's code, but just aren't unlockable in any way. Now the Phantom. Now similar to the McLaren, you can actually apply racing modifications to it, but again only with the use of cheat codes. And the reason why I compare it to the McLaren is that the rear spoiler disappears when you apply modifications to it. And again, the stats don't change on the car selection screen, but it does become faster. Handles better, brakes better, everything. With the Cup races, the Porsche 911 and the Chevrolet Corvette appear as standard across all the versions of the game. However, on the Australian version, there was a Holden HSV VT GTS that joined the party. And on the Japanese version it was a similar story, instead with a Nissan Skyline R34. However, on the PC version of the game across all the regions, all these cars were added in together. So it's just on the PlayStation versions of the game where they decided to separate them out. In the Australian versions of the game, there are actually two extra cars. There's the Holden Commodore first of all, and here are all the colour schemes of it. And I liked some of the other cars we had before. There are actually hidden colour schemes of this too. And the other addition on the Australian version of the game is the Ford Falcon. And again, here are all the colour schemes so you can see what you're missing out on. And as with most of the cars, it actually has the hidden colour schemes again, which are only accessible with cheat codes. And there's one in particular that's quite interesting. It's red, but with a red stripe. Now you might just think that I've not modified this properly, or fully. As you can see, there's quite a similar version that's actually playable. But in fact, it is indeed red with a red stripe, which is really odd. On the Japanese versions of the game, other than the replacement for the Corvette, there's one extra car, and it's a standard Nissan Skyline. Here are all the colour schemes. Though no secret colour schemes for this one, unfortunately. Now the Ford Falcon actually kind of exists on the PAL and NTSC versions of the game. The car is just a Mercedes SLK, and it has the same stats, basically the same everything as the SLK, so hardly any of the Ford Falcon was left at all. Now, let's talk about the police cars. They're usually only playable in hot pursuit mode. However, with the use of cheat codes, you can actually play as them in a race. But what's more, is that you can actually apply racing modifications to these cars as well, making them faster and, depending on opinion, better looking too. These first colour schemes are actually from the Australian version of the game. They're available as standard on the Australian version of the game. However, on the PAL and NTSC versions, they do appear too, but are only playable with cheat codes. And there's also a police version of the Holden Commodore. Of course, this is exclusive to the Australian version as well. Now the Caprice is quite an interesting one, because while the other racing modifications are quite basic and follow a similar pattern to their standard cars, for example the BMW M5's racing modifications are the same on the normal version and the police version of the car. However, with the Caprice, you've got a full-blown engine that doesn't really appear anywhere else on the game, which suggests that it was made just for this car. What's interesting as well is there was actually a taxi version of the Caprice that appeared in the trailer for the game, and as well as the TV commercial, I believe. However, there's unfortunately no trace of it in the final game at all, so it may have just been something that was made for the commercial, or in fact was just removed before the final game. Here are all the rest of the police car modifications. There's also the police helicopter too. Now you can unlock this car normally, but it's only available in test drive mode. But with the use of cheat codes, you can actually use it in a race. Now, onto some more hidden colour schemes. Here's some for the Ferrari F50. Again, it's not known why these were removed, but they're pretty cool to find. And here's the DB7 too. Now this red colour scheme, you may confuse it with one that's actually playable in the game. So I've done a little comparison here. Now as you can see, on the one that's playable, there's a gold stripe, and on the one that's actually hidden or removed, there's a white stripe. Now how about this colour scheme for the BMW as well? Fluorescent green with a yellow stripe. Pretty interesting. Another personal favourite here. This removed colour scheme for the Ferrari 550 Maranello actually is made up of 3 different colours, which is quite uncommon in the game. Usually it's just a base colour and then a colour for the stripe. And a couple more for the Ferrari F50 too. On these, they're both quite similar to colour schemes which were already available in the game, which is maybe why they ended up being removed. So I've just put a quick comparison in here, just so you can tell the difference. Now, just to talk about the Titan for a moment. Like some of the other cars, you can actually apply racing modifications to this car, and while it doesn't physically look any different, the stats definitely improve. As you can see, a comparable lap time is over 15 seconds quicker when you apply racing modifications. And as well, there is some evidence to suggest that they actually experimented with applying another colour scheme to the racing modified version. Now you can see it best on the green colour scheme here. It's kind of a maroon red that surrounds the engine and where the driver sits. Now similar colour schemes do exhibit the same signs. However, they're not as visible as on the green colour scheme. As you can see here with the dark blue one, there is a dark purple colour scheme that surrounds the engine and the cab. But however, it's just not that visible. But believe me, it is there. Now, onto the traffic cars. Now these only usually spawn on test drive mode, but with the use of cheat codes again, you can actually make them playable. And I like the Titan, although they don't exhibit any physical differences, and their stats don't improve on the car selection screen. By adding racing modifications, they do become faster. They brake better, they handle better, etc. And they're actually quite good cars to drive. They can mix it with the likes of the M5, even the Ferrari 550 Maranello. So they are kind of a welcome addition that brings a new challenge to the game if you're looking for one. Here are all the traffic cars in all their glorious colour schemes.
in 5th